afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Leon Cook. I'm the founder of Atticus Communications. It's my great pleasure to host today's webinar on net zero and the future home standard, and to be joined by three eminent panelists who I think definitely have the brain power to tackle this most important of issues. Practical issues. This is recorded and on record, so please mind your P's and Q's. And notwithstanding, if you could remain on mute unless called to ask a question, we're going to try and make this as interactive as humanly possible. So open up for Q&A at the end of this. We've had some pre-submitted questions, but if you'd like to ask anything to our guests, if you could direct your questions to me in the chat. Without further ado, I'll introduce our three panelists. We are joined by Christopher Pincher MP, member for Tamworth since 2010, and has seen his fair share of industry departments. He's been an assistant whip, a whip, deputy chief whip, he's been the Europe minister, and 15 months, I believe, to the day, was made housing minister. So he's absolutely across his brief and can answer any question you might ask of him. I'm sure he'll be very thankful for that setup. Also joined by Colin Macpherson, who is ENGIE UK Places and Communities CEO, and prior to that was a business development director for Carillion Services. Colin has been at ENGIE in his current capacity since 2016, and also Kate Henderson, Chief Executive of the National Housing Federation. She's been there since 2018, and prior to that was also the Chief Executive of the Town and Country Planning Association. She, in addition to her current responsibilities, is a visiting professor at the Bartlett School of Planning. So with that said, I think we have three people who can absolutely get their teeth into the meat of this issue. Rather than hear from me, I will hand over now to our panelists to outlay their view on this issue. I'll come at this with three quick points, though, if I may, Chris, and I'll start with you. At the end of last year, the Climate Change Committee said that £360 billion would be needed to decarbonise the built environment. 250 billion of that was for upgrades and 110 for public and commercial, which shows the size of the either problem or opportunity, as you may look at it. Notwithstanding the future home standards, which of course is for new build, 80% or 85% of homes by 2050 are already existing. And by the government's own estimate, by 2035, between 35 or 65 billion pounds will be required in investment to reach EPC standard. So there are enormous challenges to this issue, but as ever, I'm sure you've got the answers. If you would like to talk about also housing and planning was featured very heavily and centrally in the Queen's speech this week. So maybe give your view of how MHCLG and sister departments, I'd say, Bays and Treasury, are helping to meet that challenge.
Well, thanks very much, Leon, for that entirely unsolicited testimonial. I was saddened to hear how long in the tooth politically I am, given all the jobs that you reminded me that I have held in the past 11 years. In fact, I thought at one stage you were going to tell everybody how many press-ups I can do. You seem to know a great deal about me, but it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks to ENGIE UK for this net zero webinar. You raised a few, I think, very apposite points about the challenge that we face to decarbonise our environment in a relatively short period of time in order to meet the challenges and the objectives that the Prime Minister has set us. And we know that we need to have the skills and the resources in order to do it. So let me just tell you a little bit about what we are doing as we emerge from the pandemic to address the issue of a resurgent economy. The Prime Minister, back in November last year, which he reiterated again on, I think it was April 20th, set out a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. And that went hand in hand with setting a very, very ambitious net zero target. We're putting aside £12 billion of government investment to support something like 250,000 highly skilled jobs for the future, which will be right for the UK. Making homes and public buildings greener and more sustainable is a key tenet of that plan and that platform. We want to install something like 600,000 heat pumps every year by 2028. That's roughly enough power to heat every building in a city the size of Birmingham, whether you're in a studio flat or whether you're in Symphony Hall, doing that each and every year, because we know that heating and powering buildings accounts for something like 40% of our total energy use. And that's why, quite apart from the money that we're putting in to make sure that we've got the skills, we're introducing, as you alluded to, the Future Homes Standard, which by the middle of this decade, with a ramp up beforehand, we'll see new homes producing at least 75% fewer emissions than those homes built under present building standards. And those buildings, those new buildings, will be future-proofed with low carbon heating, high levels of energy efficiency through the use of most effective fabrics. And crucially, they're going to be zero carbon ready. We will not have to go through the costly retrofit, which challenges many existing stock buildings, and where government needs to work across departments. So BEIS needs to work with MHCLG to make sure that retrofitting is done as effectively as building new homes with fewer carbon emissions. But it's not just about homes. It's also about commercial premises and improvements to those as well. So starting from, again, 2025, the Future Building Standard will promote low carbon heating and better insulation in places that we use every day: cinemas, supermarkets, shops, our offices. And changes that we'll be bringing in to Part L and Part F of the building regulation standards this year for new non-domestic buildings, that could cut carbon dioxide emissions by as much as a quarter. But as you rightly said, and as I previously mentioned, it's not just about making those new homes efficient, it's about making sure that we retrofit them. And that's why the government, through BEIS, has committed, £1.3 billion in the next financial year to help installers, builders and plumbers improve homes and premises in the private sector. We're also, as you will know, completing the work on our consultation on our planning reforms in the Planning for the Future white paper, which we launched last year. We want a quicker, more simple, more predictable planning system that will enable us to build effectively those new homes, but will also bake in things like biodiversity net gain, which will also bake in the environmental and green concerns that I think many people have as our lives have changed as a result of the pandemic. So I'm very keen to hear, so I won't go on for too long, the feedback that your panelists have and that your viewers and listeners have on those proposals. Let me just say in conclusion one thing, because in the office that I have, that I'm not presently sitting in, because it's rather a cold office, in the Department for Housing and Communities and Local Government, I've got some sketches by the designer, the architect, Paul Laszlo. And he produced in the 1950s, late 50s, I think it was, his Atomville sketches. And he suggested that by 2004, most of us would be living underground, and that we would be all using flying cars. Now, Elon Musk doesn't even go that far with respect to flying cars. So it just demonstrates how architects and designers can get as much wrong as they can get right. But what he did get right was pointing out that the home of the future would redefine and redesign the way in which we consume energy for heating and for cooling and for power. Those sketches show glass enclosed rooms, open to the heat, open to the light and the sun. And his compatriot, who was the dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Minnesota, a chap called Ralph Rapson, he designed the Greenbelt House years and years and years before living walls, which are now de rigueur, were conceived of. He took the outdoors and put them indoors with plants and trees inside homes. What they both realized was that the home of the future would be cleaner, would be greener, and more energy efficient. That's what our objectives are through our policies in our Planning for the Future white paper, through our commitment to investing in jobs and in skills, and through our determination to drive forward the future homes and future building standards. They can ensure we lead the way in the world toward net zero. And I hope that to again coin what Laszlo said, as a result, we can produce something which is truly beautiful and truly wonderful. Back to you, Leon.
Thanks very much, Chris. I will pick up on a couple of those points, I think, later on, but I'd rather hear immediately from Colin and Kate on that. I think the direction of travel, the ambition is absolutely right, and the UK is absolutely leading in that respect. I think some of the practicalities of how that policy rolls out or how industry implements that is where there potentially needs to be some further focus. Colin, if I turn to you, I mean, from what I can read, I can see it's being demonstrated up and down the country in terms of how ENGIE UK is approaching this topic. You're involved in the largest ground source heat pump system for Enfield. You're doing the largest European passive house retrofit project in Portsmouth. Rugeley Power Station development is going to deliver 2,300 new low carbon homes. ENGIE Zero, you've got an award-winning retrofit project and approach. I mean, rather do your marketing for you. So all of that combined, you have a lot of skin in the game here. But I guess what I would ask you is, given what you've just heard from Mr. Pincher and how you're working with the rest of industry and other local authorities, how do you respond to this direction of travel, delivery of net zero by 2050 as a society, or whether the future home standard is fit for purpose? Your thoughts, please.
So thanks, Leon, and thanks for doing the marketing job for me. You're clearly much better than I am. So yeah, as an organisation, we are working on a number of schemes across the UK, which are looking very much around the decarbonisation agenda. I guess for those who aren't familiar with the organisation, our heritage has been in looking at decarbonisation of the energy network and the generation of energy. But we also look at the built environment, particularly around the building of new homes and retrofitting existing stock. So I think in terms of the challenge ahead of us, Leon, to pick up my point, it is a significant one. But I personally think that with the challenge comes this huge opportunity to not just look at the decarbonisation of homes, but also look at how we rejuvenate local communities. We can look at how we improve people's health and well-being by providing better quality homes. We deal with fuel poverty, but also we look at how we can reskill and retrain people, because one of the big challenges in here, which I'll come to in a second, is this is quite a seismic shift in some areas for us. We're going to have to address our ability through our supply chain and the people who work in our industry to address a completely different technical solution that's needed. So I think first and foremost, we applaud the approach. We think it's a really great one. But just touch on the future home standard for a moment. You mentioned a couple of projects we're working on. I think it's fair to say that the standards which are being sought and achieved through the future home standard, many people are already addressing those standards and are actually playing to our scheme in Rugeley actually the performance of the homes there through enhanced fabric. We're off the grid in terms of heating. We're looking at different forms of heating, whether air source heat pumps or solar thermal solutions. We're already achieving some of these standards. And I guess the point that comes from that is, are we really being ambitious enough against our overall target to decarbonise the UK against the timetable that's been set out? So I guess I'll just leave that as an open point. But for us to respond, though, in terms of industry, which I think was perhaps the kind of core of the question, what seems to me is we are at a point now where we do have an array of the technical solutions that allow us to deploy decarbonisation, whether it's in new homes or retrofitting. I think the challenge really is more in the retrofitting space, so looking at existing stock. You mentioned yourself that 80% of the housing accommodation in 2050 exists today. So really it's a call for us to address that. And the technical solutions there are much more complicated. You know, there is no one size fits all. We need to find, however, a systematic and standardized approach to dealing with decarbonisation of the existing stock. And I think in there's a little bit of a play around the energy grid as well. Sometimes we focus on the actual built environment, the built asset. I think we need to consider the demands we're going to start to place on the energy network as well, particularly around the distribution network in local areas. The approach we've taken around the technical solutions, we piloted a number of different approaches. You mentioned our ground source heat system. We've obviously got the ENGIE Zero product you talked about. We've actually got an ENGIE home design as well. And we're very much in the thinking we need to pilot these schemes, get them deliverable both in terms of the technical solution, but to reach a price point before we scale them up. So I think there's quite a lot to do still to get there, but we're pretty well advanced in terms of the technical solution. I think the bit that's maybe a concern around the technical solution is the means by which we can convince the general public that a shift away from what's been their standard use of heating systems for the last 30, 40, 50 years is moving away to something which is completely different in terms of how they control and how they use it. However, that all said, I think perhaps the most challenging area here is the whole question of funding. The numbers are significant, whichever source you go to look at the scale of investment required to decarbonise our homes. And I think, quite frankly, it's the area which we haven't really got an absolute answer to at this point in time. It seems to me that the scale of it requires some sort of new thinking around that. I don't think it can simply be a case of grant funding that comes from government. I think it's going to requires some innovative solution. Maybe it's green bonds. We know there's different types of approach being promoted by the private sector. CEB have got this concept of the green rental agreement where there's a shared contribution to it from investors and from the house owners. And I think the area that makes it really difficult is when we start to move into the private rental owner-occupied properties. They're going to be particularly challenging. And it seems to me that one thing we desperately need is a kind of cohesive playbook, if you like, as to how we will approach the funding of decarbonisation of homes over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And I guess the last piece, I'll just finish on this, is all about where the leadership comes to deliver this programme, because I think we need to contemplate an integrated approach between not just central government, but the local government agencies, and the bringing together of both private and third sector organisations into this, because it seems to me that it's such a challenge that we can't rely upon any single body to take this forward in their own right. It needs an approach which is tailored locally, because at the end of the day, the result needs to be suitable for a local community and suit the local stock. But I think it needs the overarching policy and strategy framework from central government to enable that. So Leon, I think it's a big challenge, but just to round off, it's one I think we're all up for. Certainly in industry, we can see the opportunities there, and obviously we see ourselves as contributing to it.
Well, thanks very much for that, Colin. Very good introduction, and gives a general flavour of how ENGIE is approaching this problem. Kate, I'll turn to you if I may. I mean, the NHF has a wide plethora of members. It sits across every possible policy area of this sector. And given that, we are operating on the back of a pandemic, or still in a pandemic, which may have encumbered efforts in some way, but the sector's facing huge challenges in terms of how to cut carbon emissions, delivering a major program of safety remediation work as well as building tens of thousands of new homes. given all of that, how are your members facing up to their commitments, and what is it more that you would potentially want to see from government to assist in these efforts?
Well, thanks, Leon, and it's great to be here this afternoon. I think I want to start by saying we have a government that has set out a hugely ambitious target on emissions reductions. And I think that that is absolutely to be welcomed, both the 2050 target, but also the confirmation of the 2035 target of a 78% reduction compared to 1990 base levels. And whilst it might not feel like it, climate change is the biggest challenge facing our economy and society in the medium and longer term. And it's really incumbent on us to make sure we're all playing our part in that, and housing associations absolutely want to. If we're going to meet those targets, and we've just heard very clearly from the Minister and from Colin that we need to take action on our homes, and that means making existing homes more energy efficient, it means moving to low carbon forms of heating, and it means building new homes to much higher environmental standards, to net zero standards. And we welcome the Future Homes Standard. We welcome the consultation in 2019, and we support the introduction of a new standard and cutting emissions by 2025. And I think that is really important, that the new homes that we build will not need to be retrofitted going forward. Also really do focus government's commitment to decarbonising our existing homes, and a focus on starting with the social housing sector. And we think that that's right, and we welcome the funding that's come forward from BEIS in the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. You know, decarbonising our homes isn't just about climate change. For us, it's about, you know, what it's going to do for residents. So it means their homes are going to be more comfortable to live in. It will help their health and well-being. It should help save residents money in terms of their bills. It should mean that we alleviate fuel poverty. And of course, there is a huge opportunity for economic growth and for job creation out of this agenda. And I know from talking to our members over recent months that there is a real determination and ambition when it comes to making our homes greener and warmer for residents and to tackling climate change. But I do also know, and you just mentioned this, Leon, that there are some real challenges around the scale of change that we need to see. You know, how do we retrofit well over 2 million properties across the sector in the next 30 years? And as you mentioned, this isn't our only priority as a sector. So, and Leon, you just mentioned this, you know, how do we balance this out with the need, you know, to remediate buildings in terms of building safety? That's non-negotiable, it must happen. And we also want to continue to deliver on our commitment to building many more affordable homes. So it's balancing that. And when talking to members, they ask the questions that Colin just raised, you know, actually, where do we start with retrofit, and what technologies are the best ones to use, and how do we work with, engage and infuse residents? As social landlords, we do have a unique relationship with our customer, but we need to bring them with us on this journey. They need to be a driving force and co-create those solutions with us. There's also questions around supply chains, capacity, and working together as part of this. But just as Colin said, the concern I hear most frequently from members over retrofits is how do we fund this? How are we going to finance this in the short, medium and longer term? And to better understand this, we surveyed our members last autumn. And I think this was about the barriers and obstacles to retrofit. Headline findings, overwhelming majority, almost 3 in every 4 said the funding to do this at the scale and pace we're going to need to do it to meet those targets was without doubt kind of the biggest obstacle. And then half of respondents to that survey cited the need to have more policy clarity, the detail, so that we can plan effectively and with confidence around the pathway to net zero. Other things, and we've just heard them around, you know, making sure we use technologies that are proven. We do not want our residents to be a test bed. We don't want to be investing in things that we then have to retrofit later on. Making sure that we balance the priorities of climate change with priorities around supporting residents who've been impacted by the pandemic, and of course the safety crisis, and also making sure, you know, we have the skills and supply chains. I'm sure to many of you on the webinar, these challenges will sound familiar, and that's why we've just at the Federation launched a major new project looking at decarbonisation. And this is going to be about how do we help the sector navigate those challenges, but also how can we support the sector working with partners, working with national and local government to deliver on that journey to net zero. So really happy to touch on the project and the questions, looking forward to the discussion, and really just want to emphasise just the important role of the social housing sector on this journey to net zero.
Thank you very much for that, Kate. I would describe you three as the experts and me as a layman on this. But what I would say, from my understanding of the material, is, as I look at this as I own my home, what is going to make me want to invest in? I'm talking specifically about retrofitting now. Are the unit costs of this actually prohibitive in terms of, unless I know that I'm in my forever home, am I going to, spend that money to retrofit my home? And therefore, whether public sector and social housing has to be where we start with this. And I guess my question to the Minister would be that if 3.8 billion in funding in terms of the social housing decarbonisation fund has already been earmarked, do we legitimately think that that is enough? And is that money being released quickly enough to basically make sure that we hit these targets? Because I think that is one thing from what I find in media copy and having spoken to other private sector participants, that there is a concern that that needs to come on faster. Your thoughts on that, Chris?
Well, we committed to making the spend. In fact, we've now committed to spending more than we said in our manifesto. So I think we have got the ambition right. We've got the funding available to decarbonise the social housing sector. That's why the £3.8 billion has been set aside. In terms of timeline, and this also, I think, maps onto the points that Colin was making earlier about the future home standard. We've got to make sure that we've got the supply chain of skills and materials in order to undertake this plan. Certainly, the industry has told us that the timeline that we're working to, as long as they've got the certainty that that isn't going to slip, gives them the space to make the necessary changes and adjustments to their own models in order to deliver against the plan. I had a meeting with a significant number of larger developers a couple of weeks ago, and they all said, yeah, we're up for this, but just make sure that you're certain about your timelines. Well, we are, and that, I think, will also contribute toward making sure that the target is met. So the money's available, the timetable is clear, we just now need to get on and do it.
I mean, Colin, ENGIE have been involved in the use of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund and seeing it as a catalyst for innovation. How have you been involved with SHF DF bids, and what is your experience of that thus far? I
think it's well, we have been involved. We're actually supporting about a third of the projects which are underway and they've had committed funding under the SHDF. I think the approach actually needed some input, I think, from an industry partner to help the applications get grounded and get received and get approved. I think it's been it's demonstrated that working with our customers, we've managed to help secure some of that funding. So I think it's been relatively successful. I think the point, just going back to the Minister's statement about the level of investment, I don't believe that the volume of money which is being allocated through the SHDF will be sufficient by any means to solve the problem. I think what it does do is create the catalyst to allow us to start to go back to my point about we need to pilot and improve the way in which we can deliver a decarbonisation solution. It will allow us to deal with that. I think the next big issue really for all of us, not just the industry, but I think collaborating with our customers and government, is how do we drive the cost of retrofitting and decarbonisation down. If you look at the parallel with regard to things like offshore wind, where we've seen the cost of renewable energy in that space drop significantly, I think we need to try and find a way. We won't be able to mimic it exactly because clearly that's a very standard solution against a set type of criteria, whereas obviously what we have here is a very diverse type of stock and asset type. But I do think we need to find a way to drive the costs down. And I think if we can do that, in my mind, and I think I've made this fully on, is that I think that the social housing market taking the lead in this space is absolutely fantastic, because what it will help us do is prove a model which then in turn be scalable across whether it's you as a owner occupier or into a private rental space. But I think the experience so far has been positive, but quite frankly, we're only at the beginning. We've got to prove the model, prove the technology, get the price point down, and then deploy.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. Last question from me before I open it up. So to UK, I recently read something by you on net zero by 2050 and the decarbonisation roadmap. And I know that the NHF has, you've launched a major new project on decarbonisation, and you're going to produce or publicise those findings in early autumn and in the run up to COP26. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what the objectives of that project are?
Yeah, sure, of course. Before I do that, just on the social housing decarbonisation fund, this is hugely welcome to have this funding, and I think we've had the first tranche of 50 million, the new tranche of 60 million, and now that's being expanded. That is really, really positive. I think what would be fantastic to see is to see slightly longer term time horizons. So I think these have been on an annual basis so far. It would be great to be able to look at, okay, how do we get to EPCC and the fabric first approach and prioritising the funding for that up to 2028 or 2030, and really making sure that the sector knows this is available and can be used. And I think one of the things that social housing has, as housing associations, our members own and manage over 2.5 million properties, homes to 6 million people, but they also pretty much have every housing type and have housing stock in every part of the country, and actually really working with housing associations in the way that Colin has just said, and also with councils and ALMOs, around understanding the best solutions for different housing types, so that we do start seeing those economies of scale, so that we can share the learning between different areas, so that we are working out what is the best solution for a 1930s semi versus a 1950s or 60s tower block versus something that maybe is slightly more modern, and making sure that we're getting those economies of scale, because I think it's trying to maximise the potential of the funding that we've already got available. And then just very briefly on our new project, what we've found from talking to members is there's so much good work happening already, but it's quite piecemeal. People are working to different definitions of what net zero means. And there's quite a lot of confusion around kind of which solutions to go for, which technologies, and also starting to look at funding. So that is what the project's going to do. It's going to define what does net zero mean for the social housing sector. It's going to look at how are we calculating emissions and what is the footprint of the sector. It's going to look at what are those technological barriers and identify the best solutions, and similarly what are the financial barriers, and come up with some creative financial solutions. And I completely agree with Colin, we need to be very open-minded and creative about how we think about financing this over the next 30 years, so that we can also meet those other objectives. And ultimately the project is going to come up with a route map to 2050 for the sector. And hopefully this will fit in neatly with the timing of COP26, but also with the next spending review as well, and our engagement with MHCLG, but also BEIS, Treasury and other parts of government.
Very good. Well, thank you for that. Without further ado, we'll try and open it up now. Our first submitted question is from Nigel at Ilka Homes. I'm not sure if Nigel is on the call still. Are you there, Nigel? If you are, could you please unmute yourself? No? Okay, I'll read it out for him then. 10 years ago, ENGIE Regeneration delivered 91 zero carbon homes on a Homes England HCA supported scheme ahead of the 2015 standard. Will MHCLG and Homes England support schemes targeting the future home standard ahead of 2025 to help builders optimise their solutions and scale up the supply chain? I think that's for you, the Minister.
Well, the short answer is yes. We are ramping up building regulations to improve energy efficiencies in new homes built up to 2025, and then introduce the FHS in 2025. And the reason for that is to make sure that the sector and its supply chain is ready with the skills and the tools in order to implement successfully the future home standard and still build the 300,000 new homes a year that we want built by the middle of this decade. Nigel mentions Homes England. Homes England investing significantly, supporting organisations which are using innovative technologies. MMC is a major innovator that we can harness to ensure that new homes are built more rapidly and more green and energy efficient, and which create more skills in parts of the country that need and want those skill sets. So yes, is the short answer. We will ramp up more rapidly than 2025, and Homes England will play a major part in that success.
Thank you very much for that. Next question is from Matt at Jigsaw. Matt, if you could ask your question, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Our question comes from the electrification and decarbonisation of the grid that's happening at the moment. We provide electric heating and efficient electric heating with smart controls. At the moment, though, we are being penalised for recommending new control systems and heating for new builds because the SAP figures still see our grid as, well, dirty in essence, and it's not. It's cleaner than it ever has been before, and it's getting cleaner each year. So when are the SAP figures going to be updated for the current standard of what our grid is running at?
Again, I think that's for you, the Minister.
Well, I shall reverse to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Bays, if he were here. As he is not, I will have to go and ask him and get back to you, Matt, separately.
Okay, thank you.
Next question from Hazel Hill. Okay, I'll read it out instead. Taking into account future home standards, what is the thought process regarding park homes and improvements in their build standard? Colin, you might also want to jump in on that.
I think in order to deliver a decarbonisation agenda, I think we've got to contemplate that the entire stock needs to be addressed. I don't think we should be limit the ambition to apply the decarbonisation standard across the entire asset base. So I'm not entirely clear whether there's a particular point to the question that's being raised, but it doesn't seem to me that we should look to disqualify any particular asset type from the ambition of decarbonisation.
Well, I mean, piggybacking off that, I'd ask you this, Kate, do you think, or do you hear from your members that off-site construction will have a very key role in the delivery of the London plan or the future home standard? How important do you think that really is?
Well, I think off-site modern methods of construction is really exciting. I think it is absolutely going to be an important part of our future supply. The government has massively committed to that. The new Affordable Homes Programme has a percentage requirement to do MMC. Some of our members have their own factories, like Accord and Swan Housing Association, and are doing great things. Others have good kind of well-established joint venture partnerships also with manufacturers. But others are just at the start of the journey. And so again, there is a learning curve with MMC. I think that there is going to be massive sustainability advantages, one of which is you can completely track the supply chain of every single component part going in a different way to traditional construction. Huge benefits in terms of actually workforce, in terms of encouraging new people to go into construction as well. And that's really, really important. There are some challenges just in terms of cost to begin with, location of factory to build site, all of those kind of things. But I think we'll work through that in partnership with government, in partnership with Homes England, as we increasingly see more MMC. So, and also, of course, with any of these things, working with the financial sector who loan to the sector, but also very importantly provide mortgages to the consumer, of making sure that we're all on that journey together, so everybody is working together for the same objectives, which is sustainable new homes built well, some through MMC and some traditional.
Just on that question that Kate raised, or that point that Kate raised, Leon, it's probably worth saying, I'm sure Kate will know this, and it will please her when I say it, that part of the new Affordable Homes Programme, the 2021-2026 remit, which encompasses some £11.5 billion of additional public money to build, we reckon, something like 180,000 new homes during the course of the 5 years. A significant proportion of that AHP monies that we will work with our partners to build homes with will be earmarked for MMC homes production, and that, as well as the work that people like Mark Farmer are doing to ensure that there is standardization in the industry and through its supply chain, will help put further impetus behind the development of MMC in this country.
Thank you very much for that. I just want to pick up on one. Financing money is a common theme that has been in the 41 minutes that we've been going ran through this. I mean, Colin, I want to pick up on something you said earlier about green bonds, or whether they're at the Green Financing Institute and Initiative. Is there enough provision currently within the sector to basically finance these projects, or do you think that there are other new models, other new coalitions that need to be built to help enable delivery against these plans?
I think that the short answer from my perspective is that we need a relatively significant injection of funding to achieve the outcome we're trying to deliver. And my personal belief, and I'm happy to be corrected by people who know more than I, is that in order to achieve that, we need to be looking at different means of funding. I don't think it can simply be a question of government grant. I don't think it can be a question of diverting the existing funds that many RPs, local authorities, already have badged against their continued spend on social housing. That just seems to me counterintuitive. I think there is an appetite in the market, particularly for the ESG component, recognise the fact that this is actually doing something for society with the right thing. I think that the challenge in amongst all this is going to be around the construct to make sure it is attractive to the homeowner, in the sense of private rent and owner-occupied and even private rental, and making sure in the context of social housing that there is a means by which the investment can be repaid over a period of time. These organisations tend to look at relatively low cost of capital, so it's actually not necessarily a barrier in that sense, but it's how you capture the long-term saving that's generated from reducing the energy cost, and how do you capitalise that to make it an investable option at the outset. Now, there's quite a lot of work going on around this. I understood a while ago that HMT were even looking at how could you create a model around it. My sense is that there's a little bit of, going back to my point about piloting, I think we need to try it to find out if it works, because we can spend quite a lot of time reflecting on the pros and cons, but until we actually try it, I'm not convinced actually we'll get to a point where we've got a workable model. I think the last thing, Leon, is there's obviously been some historic endeavours in this space where the incentivisation model for homes, so the Green Deal, the incentivisation model for the homeowner just wasn't going to deliver the outcome for an individual. We need to get that component of this right. So it needs to be, I think there is a market for it. I think we need to try and find the right way which suits both investors, owner-occupiers and private rental owners as well.
Thanks for that, Colin. Next question from Peter Norse.
Thank you, Leon. I work for Clarion Housing Group. I'm also part of the NHF task group that Kate mentioned earlier on this subject. Just a question to the Minister, really. Without a clear definition from the Government Minister on net zero carbon, is there a danger of inconsistent approaches across the sector? Thank you.
Well, I hope not, Peter. I think the definition is pretty clear. What we've tried to do, though, in our approach is not to be prescriptive about the toolkit, but be clear about the outcome. So the use of heat pumps as the heating mechanism in properties, the use of most appropriate fabrics is encouraged, but we've not specified that X must be used over Y, or that Z absolutely must not be used. What we want is to try to make sure that the outcome is what is achieved, but the means by getting there is left to some local flexibility.
Thank you for that. Next question from Charlotte Oral.
Hi there. I'm not actually Charlotte. I'm using Charlotte's computer, so apologies for that. My name's Dan Jestico from Iceni Projects. The question I have is what role is there for green hydrogen in the decarbonisation of heat? Is it realistic at scale, or are we better off focusing on widespread electrification of heating in both new and existing homes?
Crikey. Kate, would you like to tackle that one?
Well, luckily, I've been reading up on hydrogen recently. I actually did a master's in environmental technology about, I don't know, a decade or so ago. And we've been reading up on it recently because of the debate around heat pumps versus hydrogen. I mean, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, grey hydrogen, there's probably going to be a place for all of it. I think there's going to be, what we really need to be able to do is look, I mean, one of the things housing associations have is the ability to look not just at the home, but the building, the street, the neighbourhood, the wider community, as do local authorities. And if we can do that and think about heat and sustainability in that sense, we will then be able to identify the best solutions for each area. And in some areas, absolutely, it will be heat pumps. And in other areas, it will be different types of hydrogen, and it will be dependent, you know, on the infrastructure around those places. So I think at the moment, it feels like all of those options should be on the table. But that's also very hard in terms of making an investment decision right now of which one do you pick until we know which is the preferred option or the best option for a specific geography or location. But I do think hydrogen will play a role.
Do you agree with that, Colin? Do you see that as something that ENGIE will be utilising in terms of its net zero offer going forward?
We're doing hydrogen trials in France already in our gas network. So we're looking to feed in hydrogen to try and decarbonise the gas system. I think Kate's spot on with the response. You know, I think it's part of, and I think it's quite difficult to say that it's going to be one particular solution in one place, one particular solution in another is the one that best fits. I think with regard to the ability to green the gas, which is in our existing network, hydrogen clearly present an option around that. But we'll come back to the same questions about affordability and deliverability, because the generation of hydrogen, you know, requires a huge amount of electricity to generate it, and therefore you question then after that about how you transport hydrogen. So we're doing a trial up in the northwest right now, looking at a way to create a hub in an industrial setting for hydrogen. But if it can work there, the question is, can you again roll it into communities rather than homes? So I think it is part of the solution, but it's another one of these technical points we need to square away against the affordability envelope we're working within. So the answer is it's got a part to play. It's got a long way to work through in terms of its solution yet.
I agree with that. I have to smile beneficently on hydrogen because our parliamentary private secretary in the department, Jacob Young, is the MP for Redcar and is also the chair of the APPG for hydrogen. But I'm sure he will accept, and we will all accept, that it is as yet, if you will, an unestablished technological solution. So we're going to assess the feasibility of safely transitioning toward hydrogen, and the work that Colin has referred to and the point that Kate has made are integral to that.
Thanks very much. I'm going to abuse my responsibilities as host just to ask one question that I want to know the answer to Mr. Pincher. So is there any scope for an expansion of the technologies admitted under the RHI? Because currently I think that there are other technologies that could benefit that, basically that subsidy that would help contribute towards effectively what we're talking about today, but currently aren't allowed to participate. Do you know anything or could comment on that?
I'll ask the Chancellor and the BEI Secretary for you.
Oh, if you'd be so kind. Thank you very much. Next question from, I don't know the name, but I know the organisation, the Folkestone and Hythe District Council, I believe Housing Association, but whoever's on the end of that.
Yeah, it's John Holman. You're close there, but we're a local authority. So, Minister, everybody else, hello. My question, well, money aside, is about retrofitting, and it's about pace, quality, and skills. I was in a seminar I think it's the other week, where they were talking about, to meet the 2050 target, we need to be retrofitting a property every 3 seconds to meet the target. And it's really a comment about avoiding what we've learned in the past about poor quality of work and how we're going to meet the target. We don't have the skills. We're still trying to work out what technology will work for us. And, we're still, and in previous roles as well, we picked up problems where we had a big expansion of cavity wall insulation, for example. It was put in, targets were met, but we're now taking out that cavity wall insulation because it was the wrong stuff, or the people that were doing it didn't have the skills to do it correctly, or it was rushed just to meet targets. So I'm not sure that's a question, really a comment, and something to think about going forward in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much. A question from Jed Young, please.
Thanks, Chair. And I'm also from a local authority setting. I feel very positive about new build personally. And, I deliver new council homes. Much as Kate has said, social housing sectors, very much behind delivering low and zero carbon homes. And, I've been around for a while. You might be able to tell by the beard. I remember when eco homes was introduced, and there were projections about 40% cost barriers and 25% cost barriers, which didn't materialize. And as Colin has said, the price points start to settle as people have, road tested and used and developed the approach. And we're all very comfortable with innovation and probably the pace on new build as well. But I do wonder about the scale of the change needed in existing stock, and that kind of access to finance particularly. And it's something we're thinking about and looking at with our stock. And I know as Kate's members will be doing the same, and we're seeing RPs divest themselves of some particularly difficult looking stock. So shifting that burden into the private sector, which I also understand is rational to do. But I don't see, we've got about, I don't know, maybe 30 billion of, really good commitment from government now. But, I think Leon said at the outset, about 300 billion of identified spending needed. And I just don't see how we bridge that gap, without Treasury playing its part and looking at a fiscal base for climate change. I just don't see where the bridge comes in. And you could be optimistic about price points settling down, and you can absolutely expect landlords and social landlords and, probably the finance market to respond with bonds for owner occupiers. But I don't see a scale of shift necessary, to meet a 2030 and 2050 target. Without a fiscal base. I'm just wondering whether the Minister could comment on that.
Well, thanks, Jed. I think Colin made the point that the investment that the government has made and is making acts as a catalyst. If I use AHP, the Affordable Housing Programme, as an example, the £11.5 billion that we're investing in this cycle, we reckon will unlock over £100 billion of private investment. So there is a scale issue here. The private sector clearly needs to play its part, and the government money that's being invested will act as that catalyst to drive further investment from the private sector. It's also worth pointing out that the changes that we're making to the future, or the changes we're introducing with the Future Homes Standard, means that homes built after 2025 won't have to be retrofitted. And of course, there will be the creation of new homes, and there will be the replacement of some existing stock, which will remove some of the challenge that you are referring to. I personally think, quite apart from the cash, one of the biggest challenges that we are going to face is dealing with what you might call the hassle factor, because Kate will certainly know this during the pandemic, and I guess you will as well, Jed. People don't necessarily want other workers coming into their homes to do various things to their homes, particularly when the work is invasive, particularly when they've just gone through a pandemic where we've been telling everybody that you should not have people inside your homes. So I think dealing with the hassle factor of retrofitting is going to be as challenging as making sure that the funding is available.
Thank you, Chris. One, I think, for Colin, but Jeremy Potter, please.
Hello. Yeah, it's just I'm from Chelmsford City Council, and it was just really we've got a local plan in place. We've got really ambitious targets for growth in Chelmsford. But we're finding it a little bit hard to convince volume house builders to start seriously thinking about the future home standards now, rather than waiting until more of the detail comes forward and closer to 2025. We're working really closely with Countryside Properties on our garden community, Homes England. So we've got a zone that's coming out, a zero carbon zone that hopefully will be built in 2023, and that will hopefully provide some, a demonstrator to show the cost value differentials, which will provide further learning, that cut price point. But I was just wondering whether there's any other way that possibly you can start nudging volume house builders to start thinking about this now. And one of the things we've been thinking about is kind of a community infrastructure levy holiday for a fixed period of time to try and incentivize volume house builders to start really thinking about this now on the stuff that they probably have in their pipeline before 2025. I just wonder whether there are any other matters that could be looked at in relation to kind of like incentivising, in particular, the volume house builders.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, Jeremy, that you make. What incentives can be provided? By the way, I've been to Chelmsford. I've seen the developments that Countryside are building, and they are pretty impressive. So congratulations on making sure that was baked into your local plan and into your planning application agreement. The conversations I've had with the bigger developers, and I had my last one about 2 or 3 weeks ago, was the thing that they wanted more than anything else was certainty that the dates are going to stick. So we've said absolutely that we'll start the consultation in 2023 and introduce the legislation in 2024, but they need to start to get ready now. The feedback that I got from them was that they are prepared to do that, but you raised some interesting thoughts about how further incentives can be provided and further encouragement given, so I'm very happy to consider what they might be.
I'd be interested to piggyback on that with either Kate or Colin, actually. I mean, I think it's probably more for private market development, but whether you think property prices need to price in energy efficient measures, and if that is something that will help galvanize the sector. If people suddenly think that as a result of all of this, that it's going to be worth more money, then they might be, development might be more forthcoming. Do you have a view on that?
Want to go first? Okay, I think so. Just on the first point about incentivisation, I think clearly the planning process will become a particularly interesting means by which to encourage decarbonisation of schemes as they're brought into the market. So I get the point about setting the still, but actually there could be a question about how to utilise some of the planning process to encourage volume house builders to recognise the immediacy of the challenge which we have. The question about the market price on property, it's an interesting one. It's one that we've been contemplating for a while, actually, because if you do see the cost of homes incrementally increasing by virtue of the fact of introducing these measures, what does it do to the market value of property? It's a bit unpredictable at this stage. We've got a scheme you mentioned before in Rugeley, where we've got outline consent for just over 2,000 homes we're developing. And we've actually seen quite a lot of positive response from the market for people actually wanting a home which is green enabled, which is these homes are already working to future home standard, off grid, solar panels, air source heat pump, highly insulated. There is actually demand in the market for it, but I think it's not necessarily going to be everyone who's looking to basically to buy a green home. I think it goes back to my earlier point that over time, the burden of cost, if you wish to call it that, for adopting green measures, decarbonisation measures in homes should come down, in which case I don't think the market value will be affected. So I don't think it's questionably over time a choice of I'm prepared to pay an extra X £1,000s for a home in the open market, which is green enabled compared to one which isn't. I think we need to get that equalisation so it doesn't become an issue.
Thanks very much. Mr. Pincher, I'm conscious of time. Are you short or are we on last orders?
I've got to go. Robert Jenrick is waiting for me.
Well, best not to keep the boss waiting. So, well, on that note, then I will bring proceedings to an end.